On the morning of April 22nd, 1945, in a stone farmhouse 3 miles east of the Danube River, a German general named Friedrich Krentz read a single page of typewritten English and set it down on the table in front of him without speaking. His adjutant, Major Wolfgang Haas, stood near the window. He was 28 years old, and he had served under Krentz for 14 months across 3 successive commands as the war contracted around them. He had developed, as young officers do when attached to senior commanders long enough, the ability to read the quality of a silence. The general's silences had different textures. There was the silence when reviewing maps, the silence when reading casualty figures, and the silence he produced when something required a decision he had not yet made. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. This was the last kind. The farmhouse had been requisitioned from a Bavarian farmer who now lived with his wife and daughter in his own cellar. The kitchen table where Krentz sat was still set with the family's everyday pottery. Blue and white Bavarian earthenware bought at some market before the war had made such transactions feel like artifact from another civilization. The spring light came through the window at a low angle and caught the dust in the air. Outside, the sound of American artillery was continuous and close. Not the sharp crack of individual rounds, but the deeper, rolling concussion of multiple batteries working a perimeter several kilometers to the north. The message on the table was from the headquarters of the United States Third Army. It requested, in the precise language of a command that had been making such requests since Normandy, the immediate and unconditional surrender of all German forces under Krentz's command. It noted that continued resistance was militarily futile. It gave him until noon. "What will you tell them, General?" Haas asked. Krentz looked at the map on the table before he answered. He looked at it for a long time. The red and blue notations had been updated that morning, and they told a story that required no interpretation. American armor had reached the Danube to the south the previous evening. American infantry held both ridge lines to the north. The one road still nominally open to the east had been under artillery interdiction since the day before yesterday. His garrison numbered 1,100 men, fewer than 400 of them combat infantry. The rest were support troops, administrative personnel, and a company of Volkssturm militia, old men and teenage boys that the Reich's final mobilization had reached into cellars and schoolhouses to produce. He had no armor, no air support. Ammunition, his operations officer had reported that morning, for perhaps 36 hours of sustained defensive fighting. He looked at this map for a long time. Then he picked up his pen. "Tell them," he said, and his voice was quiet in the stone room, "that a German general does not receive instructions from the enemy regarding the disposition of his forces." What followed that sentence, over the next 15 hours, would answer a question that dozens of German garrison commanders were attempting to navigate in those final weeks of April 1945. What actually happens when you refuse the Third Army? The answer, when it came, took considerably less than 60 seconds to deliver. Bavaria in the spring of 1945 was a landscape in the process of discovering what defeat looked like at the level of the village church and the district road. The theoretical defeat had been approaching for 2 years. The industrial numbers told the story in the armament production figures that German economists could no longer recalculate into optimism, and the casualty returned from the Eastern Front that stacked in personnel offices from Berlin to the Rhineland. In the bomber tonnage reports that the 8th Air Force published for anyone who wanted to read what was happening to the oil refineries and the rail marshalling yards and the tank factories that the war depended on. The theoretical defeat had been understood by anyone with access to accurate information and the willingness to interpret it since the winter of 1942. The practical defeat was different. It had a specific weight and temperature. It smelled like cordite and thaw mud and the particular sweetness of fields that artillery had broken open. It looked like American tank columns moving on roads that German military maps still colored as German. It sounded like outgoing fire that was never answered, because there was no longer anything capable of answering it. Bavaria had been, for the duration of the Third Reich, the political heartland of the regime's mythology. Nuremberg, to the north, was the city of the party rallies, the city where the regime's race laws had been passed and announced to the world. Munich, further south, was the cradle of the movement itself. The Bavarian landscape had provided the visual grammar of a decade of propaganda. The white-capped Alps and the painted village squares and the Baroque church towers that stood in the background of photographs intended to represent something eternal and unconquerable about the German national character. That imagery had been built here on this specific ground. Now the Third Army was moving through it at a pace that the German command structure had no remaining capacity to slow. General George S. Patton had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim in the last week of March with an efficiency that his staff described as deliberate speed, and his critics called something less charitable. He had crossed it a full day before the heavily publicized British crossing to the north, and had chosen to inform his superiors only after the fact, with a particular studied casualness that was simply another form of operational aggression. In the weeks since, the Third Army had wheeled southeast through central Germany and turned its weight toward Bavaria along multiple axes, the 12 Corps under General Mannetti on the left, the XX Corps under General Walton Walker driving hard on the right, armor and infantry moving through a German landscape that was simultaneously surrendering and fighting, sometimes within the same town, sometimes within the same street. By the third week of April, the advance had acquired a specific momentum that Patton's staff tracked with something between professional satisfaction and controlled urgency. The German command structure in the south was fragmenting. Units that had been divisions in the Wehrmacht order of battle a year ago were operating at battalion strength or below. Communication between Army group headquarters and frontline formations had become intermittent, occasionally fictional. German commanders in the field were receiving orders from Berlin that bore increasingly less connection to the actual military situation on the ground, orders that sometimes specified the relief of positions that had already fallen or called for counterattacks with forces that no longer existed. Into this disintegrating command environment came Hitler's Festung directives, the fortress orders that had been issued and refined over the preceding months and that carried the weight of the Führer's personal authority. The orders were straightforward in their requirement. Garrison commanders would hold their positions to the last man and last bullet. The authority of field commanders to declare their positions untenable, to exercise the kind of operational judgment that the German officer corps had built its professional reputation on, was explicitly curtailed. Officers who surrendered prematurely were subject to consequences under military law that were no longer theoretical. A number of German commanders had already been executed for capitulating without authorization. The orders made certain that every garrison commander in every town across what remained of the Reich understood this clearly. These orders were the context in which Friedrich Krentz made his decision. Krentz had served the German army for 31 years. He had entered the officer corps in 1914 as a junior lieutenant barely old enough to project the authority the rank required. And he had served through 4 years on the Western Front before the armistice, and the humiliation of Versailles sent him back to a Germany trying to understand what the war had been about and what it had cost. He had stayed with the service through the Weimar years, when the army was restricted to 100,000 men and took only the most committed, and he had built a career on the careful, unglamorous professionalism that the restricted force rewarded. By the time the Second War began, he was a colonel of infantry with a reputation built on organizational competence and a tactical steadiness under pressure that his superiors noted in their assessments without quite knowing how to celebrate it. He did not have the theatrical quality the new Germany preferred in its military figures. He trained his units correctly. He filed his reports on time. He moved his men through campaigns. France in 1940, Russia in 1941 and 1942. The specific Russia of the advance, and then the retreat, and then the grinding defensive fighting that replaced any remaining fantasy of the quick campaign. He had received the Knight's Cross at Kharkov in 1943 for an action the citation described as distinguished leadership under conditions of exceptional difficulty, which was the official language for a defensive engagement where distinguished leadership was the only thing preventing the encirclement and destruction of a unit. He had held. That was what the cross meant in his mind. The capacity to hold when holding seemed impossible, to remain in position when every physical instinct was pointing toward the road behind you. He was not a National Socialist in any meaningful operational sense. He had joined the party in the mid-1930s because officers of his grade were expected to, and because the decision not to join was a more politically complex act than most professional soldiers were prepared to make. He did not attend rallies. He did not give speeches about racial destiny. He enforced the directives he was given, as he had been trained to enforce directives, and he separated his private assessments of those directives from his professional execution of them in a way that the German officer corps had always separated private judgment from military duty. What he believed in, with the genuine conviction of a man who had organized his life around the belief, was the German military tradition. The tradition of the officer who kept his word, who honored his oath, who did not surrender a defensible position without authorization, not because surrender was wrong in some abstract moral sense, but because the organized, principled resistance of a properly led garrison was what armies were, was what distinguished professional military service from simple armed violence, and was the thing that would eventually be acknowledged, across whatever came after this war, as having been maintained with dignity when everything else had failed. His orders were clear. The Festung directive from Army Group Command was unambiguous. Hold until relieved, or until the position was rendered untenable by documented criteria that required confirmation from above. He had 1,100 men and 36 hours of ammunition and no prospect of relief, and a map that showed, with the cartographic precision he had relied on for 31 years, that this position was already lost. He knew all of this. Every officer on his staff knew all of this. The numbers did not require interpretation. He wrote the reply to the Third Army's message at 8:50 in the morning. Haas took it to the interpreter, the Nuremberg schoolteacher with the unsteady hands who had been pressed into service for his 2 years in England, and the reply was transmitted to the American Forward Command post at 9:17. Within 20 minutes, the report had reached 3rd Army Headquarters. Patton was 60 years old in April of 1945. He had been studying and fighting and thinking about the German army at varying distances and intensities since the First World War. In the intervening decades, he had developed a professional relationship with the German military tradition that was more considered than his public reputation suggested. He had read German doctrine. He had studied German operational history with the methodical attention of a man who believed that the only real disrespect you could show an enemy was to understand them poorly. In certain documented moments, he had expressed something approaching professional respect for specific German commanders, an acknowledgement made without warmth, but with the precision of a man who distinguished rigorously between the uniform and the regime that wore it. What he had no patience for, in April of 1945, was time. He had been in a war against time since Normandy. His diary from this period, and the accounts left by his Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay, and his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, document a commander who understood the cost of every additional day of fighting in a unit of account that went beyond the operational map. Every day of unnecessary resistance meant specific names on letters that specific families would receive. He had signed enough of those letters personally to understand this arithmetic without sentiment. He had signed letters for black soldiers whose notification had been delayed in a bottom drawer by a clerk who made a calculation about whose grief mattered, and he had understood, when that drawer was opened, what the delay had cost in a currency that had nothing to do with military operations. He had signed the letters. And now, here was Friedrich Krentz. Gay documented Patton's response to the refusal in his personal diary. He noted the specific stillness that Patton produced in these moments, a quality that his staff had come to interpret correctly as more significant than anger. Patton read the translated message, set it on the table, looked at it for several seconds. Then he gave his orders. They were not complicated. The Third Army's operational records from this period, later compiled into the command's formal after-action documentation, show the standard response to a garrison refusal: immediate escalation of artillery tempo, acceleration of infantry assault timetables, and where armored assets were available, the commitment of additional tank support to force and exploit any perimeter breaches. The tactical object was not simply to take the position. The object was to take it with a speed and completeness that left an unmistakable record, because garrison commanders to the east and south were watching what happened to the commanders who refused, and the watching was its own form of persuasion. By 10 o'clock on the morning of April 22nd, the artillery working Krentz's perimeter had changed in character. Krentz's operations officer noted it in his post-war deposition to American military historians as the distinction between tactical and systematic fire. Tactical fire responded to specific targets, specific positions, specific observed German activity. Systematic fire covered the entire perimeter in rotation, preventing movement, making the kind of local repositioning that a competent defending force uses to compensate for numerical inferiority into a lethal exercise. It was the artillery equivalent of a closed door. The first penetration of the northern perimeter came at 11:14 in the morning. A company of infantry from the 90th Infantry Division moved through a gap that the artillery preparation had created in a section of wall that had been, 2 hours earlier, a barn. The German infantry section defending that wall had taken casualties that left them below half strength, and the survivors had done what infantry under those conditions sometimes does. They had pulled back briefly to find cover, and in pulling back they had opened a gap that an American platoon leader, moving forward on his initiative at the moment it appeared, pushed through before anyone on the German side could close it. The company followed. Another company followed the first. By the time Krentz's reserve platoon arrived to restore the line, there was no longer a line to restore at that sector. There was an American position inside his perimeter. Krentz moved his command post for the first time at 1 in the afternoon. He moved it again at 4. By 5 o'clock, the western sector had effectively ceased organized resistance. The Volkssturm militia, the shopkeepers and school teachers, and men in their 50s and boys of 16 who had been issued rifles and field caps and placed in positions that required a decade of training none of them possessed, had reached their own arithmetic. They were not soldiers. They had been made soldiers by a government that had run out of soldiers, and they had tried, in a way that amateurs attempting a professional's job always try, with a sincerity that was in inverse proportion to their preparation. By mid-afternoon, most of them had reached the limit of what sincerity could sustain. At 6:48 in the evening, Major Haas came down the cellar stairs of the second farmhouse and found Krentz sitting in a wooden chair with his service pistol in his right hand. Haas stood at the bottom of the stairs and did not speak. The general sat motionless for several minutes. The pistol was not raised. It was simply held, as if its weight were the thing being considered. Then Krentz put it back in its holster and stood up. "Tell them we are ready," he said. He meant the Americans. The white flag went out at 7:32. The fighting stopped progressively over the next 20 minutes, not simultaneously, but incrementally, as word moved through a perimeter that had already ceased to function as one. By 8 o'clock, the town was quiet. Krentz was processed at the American Forward Command Post at 9:15 in the evening. He gave his name, rank, and date of commission. He accepted the coffee that was offered. He sat through the administrative procedures of his surrender in a folding chair without speaking, while his remaining officers were processed in groups nearby. Major Haas was held separately and had no further contact with the general that night. At 11:45, a message was brought to the tent where Krentz was being held. He would be transported to 3rd Army headquarters the following morning. He sat through the night. He had time, in that tent, to conduct his own accounting. The perimeter had held for approximately 10 hours after noon, the deadline he had declined. In those 10 hours, his garrison had inflicted casualties on the assaulting American forces. The Americans had inflicted significantly larger casualties on his garrison. The figures were documented in the Third Army's operational reporting and would later be compiled by the International Red Cross when they gained access to prisoner processing records. The town itself was intact. The civilian population was alive. The war would be over across what remained of the continent within days. 10 hours. That was what the refusal had produced. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. He sat with this knowledge through the night, in a tent in Bavaria, with his pistol gone and his garrison in American custody and the spring darkness outside pressing against the canvas. In the morning, they came for him. The vehicle came for him at 7:40 in the morning of April 23rd. It was a standard American staff car, not marked in any way that indicated the destination or the purpose of the journey. Two military police soldiers sat in the front. Krentz sat in the back. No one spoke. The drive took 40 minutes through a Bavarian landscape that was in the process of coming to terms with its situation in the particular way that landscapes absorb the facts imposed on them. Slowly, without visible emotion, already looking like what they had always been. Farmhouses stood at the edges of fields that had been worked this spring by farmers who had spent the winter not knowing whether they would survive to plant. Church steeples rose above village rooflines that had not been bombed, in towns where the garrison commander had made a different decision than Friedrich Krentz had made, where the white flags had gone up before the ultimatum expired. Those towns looked like towns. The roads through them were clear. American vehicles moved through the squares without stopping. The population was visible, going about the complicated business of resuming ordinary life in circumstances that made ordinary life feel temporarily strange and permanently altered. Krentz watched them through the staff car window, without expression. He had straightened his uniform that morning in the tent with what he later described to Major Haas, in a letter written from custody, as a determination to present himself as what he was, which was a general officer of the German army, regardless of what the next hours required. The Knight's Cross was at his throat. His cap was squared on his head. His boots were dusty from the farmhouse cellar and from the walk to the transport vehicle, but they were the right boots, worn correctly. He had been a professional soldier for 31 years. That was the one thing the Americans had not taken, and he intended to keep it visible. 3rd Army headquarters occupied a requisition schoolhouse at the edge of a Bavarian market town. The building had the efficient improvisation that American military administration produced wherever it installed itself. Field telephones on desks that had been used for elementary arithmetic 6 weeks ago, operational maps pinned to walls that had displayed the 7 times table, uniformed clerks moving between rooms with the purposeful rhythm of an organization processing war at an industrial scale and close enough to the conclusion to feel the proximity without yet slowing down. Somewhere in the building, radio equipment transmitted and received the continuous traffic of an army still in motion. Krentz was brought into a side room that had been a teacher's office. A wooden desk remained against the wall. 2 American officers were already present. A captain with a legal pad, who introduced himself through the interpreter as being assigned to 3rd Army Military Intelligence, and a 2nd lieutenant who stood near the door and said nothing throughout the proceedings. The interpreter was an American sergeant from New York whose German was fluent and whose expression remained professionally neutral. Krentz noted, without comment, that the interpreter was young enough to have been in secondary school when the war began. He stood rather than sat. He had prepared what he intended to say. He had prepared it carefully during the night in the tent and refined it during the drive, turning it over in the methodical way that trained officers turn over a prepared statement, examining it for weaknesses, tightening its structure. He was not, he understood, in a position of strength, but he was in a position that had specific, documented content under international military law, and he intended to make that content explicit and precise. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established requirements for the treatment of officer prisoners that were not preferences or suggestions. They were obligations agreed to by the signatory powers, of which the United States was one, and they included specific provisions regarding the retention of personal effects, accommodation standards for officers, and the right to communicate regarding the welfare of personnel under a surrendered commander's prior responsibility. He began. He gave his name, rank, and date of commission as protocol required. He stated that, as a general officer, he was entitled under the applicable convention to retain his personal sidearm and to receive accommodation commensurate with his grade, separate from enlisted prisoners and from officers of lower rank. He stated that he expected to be transferred to a holding facility appropriate for senior officers, where conditions of captivity could be established through proper channels with American officers of equivalent standing. He stated that he wished to speak with an officer of sufficient rank to address questions regarding the continued welfare of his garrison personnel, whose proper treatment he considered a matter of his continuing personal responsibility, irrespective of the circumstances of their capture. He was precise. He was controlled. He spoke for approximately 90 seconds. Then Patton walked in. He came through the door without announcement. He was in uniform, 4 stars on his helmet liner, the ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. He came through the room without looking at anyone except Krentz and stopped 3 feet in front of him. He looked at the German general for a moment. The interpreter began to position himself. Patton told him to wait. Then Patton spoke, and the interpreter translated as he went. He said that the personal sidearm had already been collected at the forward command post the previous evening. He said that Krentz's accommodation had been determined by 3rd Army's military police and that it satisfied the convention's requirements, which Patton said he had read and which did not specify comfort as a standard. He said that the question of which American officer was of equivalent standing to a German general who had required additional soldiers to die taking a position that had already been lost was a question he was not going to dignify with a calculation. He said that the welfare of the 1,100 men of the garrison was being handled by American officers who were entirely capable of doing so without input. He stopped. The room was quiet. He looked at Krentz for a moment. Not with anger, not with contempt, precisely. With the focused attention of a man who had something exact to say and no interest in saying it at greater length than was necessary. He said that Krentz would be asked in the coming days to provide information about the German order of battle and defensive positions to the east. He said that the correct response to those questions was a complete and immediate answer. He said that protecting positions that were going to fall regardless, with information that was going to be obtained through other means regardless, was not what professional military officers did. It was what men who had confused their personal honor with their continued usefulness to a government that no longer existed did. He said that Krentz was capable of recognizing the distinction. Then he stated a number. 38 American soldiers had been killed in the assault on Krentz's perimeter after the noon deadline was declined. An additional 29 had been wounded. He said that these were specific men with specific names. He said that those names were in the process of being transmitted to their families. He said that the German dead were also being counted, and that their names would also eventually reach German families, and that all of these names, on both sides, were the product of the decision Krentz had made in a farmhouse the previous morning. He did not characterize the decision. He did not describe what the names meant. He stated the number. He stated where it came from. Then he left the room. Captain Robert Andrews, whose post-action report was filed to 3rd Army's G2 section and later preserved in the command's intelligence records, noted that the German general stood without speaking for several seconds after Patton departed. Andrews wrote that he did not try to characterize Krentz's expression with precision, but that whatever had been in it before Patton entered the room was no longer there afterward. He wrote that Krentz eventually sat down in the chair beside him and remained seated in silence for a considerable time before the debrief began. The total duration of Patton's remarks, by Andrews' account, was 53 seconds. The debrief that followed lasted 4 hours. Krentz answered every question put to him regarding the German defensive dispositions to the east. He answered them completely. He answered them without hesitation, which the American intelligence officers noted and which Krentz himself, in the letter written to Haas from POW custody 2 months later, explained without elaboration. He wrote that he had understood, after the schoolhouse, that Patton was correct. The positions to the east fell regardless. The information produced a measurably faster outcome for specific American units advancing through specific approaches. Whether the faster outcome meant fewer dead or simply fewer hours was a question he could not answer from custody. He did not suggest, in the letter, that the uncertainty offered him any particular relief. The 1,100 men of his garrison were processed through the American prisoner system over the following week. The Volkssturm militiamen were among the first released, most of them sent home to the same towns they had left weeks earlier under conditions that now looked entirely different than they had at departure. The school teachers went back to schools. The shopkeepers went back to whatever the shops had become. They walked into their civilian lives carrying whatever the preceding weeks had left inside them and resumed the identities that the Reich's final mobilization had briefly and violently interrupted. The town itself stood intact. The civilians who had spent the siege in cellars and in the basement of the church emerged to find their buildings in place. The streets were clear. The spring fields around the town were undamaged. A town still standing was, in Bavaria in late April of 1945, a fact with specific and measurable value. Krentz had held the perimeter for 10 hours past the deadline, and then he had put the pistol back in its holster and told Haas to send a message. The 10 hours of fighting had cost what they cost. The decision to end it had preserved what it preserved. The town was intact because of the second decision. The 67 names existed because of the first. This arithmetic was not available to Krentz in the moment he made his choice. It is available to history. He was held in the American prisoner of war system through the spring and summer and into the autumn of 1945. He was not charged under the denazification proceedings. His service record, as American investigators reviewed it, documented a career conducted within the norms of German military service, which was not an exoneration, but which, in the specific framework of the occupation's legal processes, did not support criminal charges. He was released in the late spring of 1946 and returned to civilian life in what had by then become the emerging structure of the Western occupation zones. He was 55 years old. He had worn the German uniform for 32 years. He settled in a town in Württemberg and spent the next decade working for a building materials contractor, a job that required the organizational competence the Army had developed in him over 3 decades, and that translated, with adjustment, to the management of construction logistics. He was not involved with veterans organizations. When the Bundeswehr began forming in 1955 and recruiting former Wehrmacht officers whose records survived scrutiny, he received one inquiry and declined it without explanation. He died in 1963. The notice in the local paper described him as a retired officer and contractor, survived by a daughter. It did not mention the Knight's Cross. It did not mention Kharkov. It did not mention a farmhouse table with blue and white pottery and a typewritten page that he had read for a long time before picking up his pen. Major Wolfgang Haas was released in the autumn of 1945 and completed the legal education the war had interrupted. He practiced civil law in Munich for 30 years. He died in 1992. He left behind a brief, privately printed memoir covering the final months of the war, 412 pages that included a careful account of the morning of April 22, 1945. He wrote about the pottery on the table. He wrote about the artillery in the north. He wrote about standing at the foot of the cellar stairs and finding the general with the pistol in his hand. Haas wrote that he had known, when he took down the general's words for the reply, that they were the wrong words. He had known it as the schoolteacher's hands shook during the translation. He had known it through the long afternoon as the perimeter contracted. He had not said so because it was not his place to say so, which was, Haas wrote, itself a statement about what training and hierarchy cost when they operated without check. He dedicated the memoir to the 23 Volkssturm men who had died in the perimeter. He listed their names individually. Most of them were from a single district. Several of them were from the same town. Patton's diary entry from April 22nd does not specifically reference the encounter with Krentz. General Gay's diary notes the visit to the intelligence facility in a single line and describes Patton returning to the headquarters map room, where he stood for 20 minutes reviewing the day's advance reports before issuing the next morning's orders. Gay wrote that Patton appeared in the map room as he always appeared after these encounters, entirely focused on what came next. The Third Army crossed the Danube. It entered Austria. On the 7th of May, 1945, Germany signed the instruments of unconditional surrender, and the war in Europe ended. Patton marked the occasion in his diary and turned his attention to what he believed was coming next, which was the Soviet threat and the inadequacy of the Allied response to it. He was not wrong about the threat, but he was not careful about how or where he said so, and a press conference in September cost him the Third Army Command. He was reassigned to the 15th Army, a headquarters writing the historical record of the European campaign. He died in December of 1945 from injuries sustained in a traffic accident outside Mannheim. He was buried in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of his command. His chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, who had recorded the 5-word memo that Patton once left on his desk after signing 112 letters, noted in a 1968 interview that the difficulty with Patton was that you could never predict which version of him you were going to get on a given afternoon. But he said that on the question of what soldiers cost when they died for nothing, he had never once seen the general equivocate. There is a question embedded in the story of Friedrich Krentz that does not resolve cleanly, which is what makes it worth examining. He organized his professional life around a tradition. That tradition held that the officer who honored his orders, who kept the position under pressure without authorization to do otherwise, who maintained his bearing and his duty in circumstances that had made both difficult, was preserving the thing that separated military service from armed disorder. He believed this not because he was a fanatic or a fool, but because he had spent 31 years in a profession that made this belief functional and necessary and real. The German officer corps had built itself on it. The campaigns that made Germany formidable in the early years of the war had been conducted by men who believed it. Kharkov, where he had held when holding seemed impossible, had been won by men who believed it. What the belief did not contain was a limiting principle. It did not specify whose orders or toward what end, or at what point the tradition's requirements became the tradition's absurdity. It did not account for the situation in which keeping the tradition alive required spending lives in the service of a government that had already spent itself. The German officer corps had navigated this question badly for 12 years, and the accumulated cost of that navigation was visible in every direction from any point in Germany in the spring of 1945. Krentz had not been among the worst of those who navigated it badly. He had been among the most ordinary, which is a different and perhaps more difficult category to account for. He had done what professional soldiers do. He had followed his orders. He had done it in a context where following orders had long since ceased to be a morally neutral act, and he had not made the adjustment that the context required. Not until the perimeter was gone and the pistol was in his hand and there was nothing left to hold. Then he put it away. In the town in Bavaria, the farmhouse still stands. The family that owned it farmed the surrounding land for 2 more generations. The kitchen table was eventually replaced, the pottery eventually replaced. The town is a market town like many others in that part of the country, not remarkable from the outside, carrying what it carries the way places do when something significant happened in them, and the people who witnessed it grew old and then died, and the significance became a matter of local memory, and then not even that. The spring comes to it every year. The fields turn green. The artillery that rolled through in April of 1945 belongs now to a world that requires imagination to reach. There's a count that belongs to this story, and that will not be reduced by whatever comes after it. 38 killed, 29 wounded, 10 hours. Those numbers have specific names attached to them. The names are in the records of the Third Army and in the records of the International Red Cross and in the memories of families across America and Germany who received the news in the weeks that followed and who carried it, in one form or another, for the rest of their lives. Patton said them aloud in a Bavarian schoolhouse in 53 seconds. He did not need more time than that. The facts did not require elaboration. They had their own weight, and they still do. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.